Good morning. How are you all doing today? I don't hear that. I need to do something about it. Hang on a sec and I'll turn it on pretty fast. So before we start the thing for today, some of the key things that I'd like to take. Switch off your mobiles and put it into the silence mode. And engage on social media. We have an account @ICT4D conference, and we have a Twitter handle #ICT4D 2017. Also sign into Sketch. All our speakers have invested a lot of efforts, and we would request you to leave your feedback after sessions, including all the sessions that you are hearing since the morning till the day end. And we also have printed copies at the registration area for the Sketch, and you can collect it from there. The lunch and refreshments to be served in Hall 4. By now, you pretty all know about it. The map gallery is there in the exhibition area. Don't forget to cast your vote. We are still figuring out who wins the best map. And your full biographies for all the speakers would be found on Sketch. Make sure we are going to just do the introductions today to make it more informative, interactive, giving more time to the speakers. And now, when I said that I don't hear that loud, I would request all of you to just stand up once, stretch up a little bit, and dance to the tune. Can we play some music? Say hello to the neighbor, guys. I see hands up. It's not happening. I don't see the hands. Yes, it's not happening. Keep the energy back in. Okay. Well, thank you. That looks like we are all ready. Oh, I hear that. Thank you. Okay. So let me start with the introduction today for our first panel. But before I go ahead, I'll just say the topic for today is enablers and barriers to open data sharing. And I would like to introduce Michael San, partner Dalberg Global Development Advisors, to be on stage. Mr. Michael San. Okay, we have a replacement.
Sorry, I'm going to replace Michael. My name is Frédéric Pivetta, and I'm leading Dalberg Data Insight. So I'm also part of Dalberg, doing the big data.
So, would you like to introduce the panelists for today? Okay, welcome on stage.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 great panelists this morning, working on data from different angles. First of all, we have Warren Price from Digital Globe, who is active in satellite data, managing satellite data. We have Syed Haza, who is a senior director at Dial, leveraging telecom data for social impact. And then we have Jawuko, who is part of the International Food Policy Research Institute, mostly active in data and impact in agriculture. So first of all, thank you very much for being here this morning, and thank you to the audience for being here this morning. So basically, I would like maybe each of you start sharing your view on the data ecosystem and how it's going to be shaping up over the coming years. Syed, do you want to start?
Thank you, Fred, to catch me the first thing in the morning, as usual, as expected. Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm the Senior Director of Data at the Digital Impact Alliance, and today I'd like to just share with you some of our experiences and really our point of view on the best approaches to open data, data sharing, mostly from a private sector perspective. I'd like to kind of quote some statistics that'll give us a sense of what this entire aspect of open data, data sharing entails. If you look at some of the predictions and market landscaping that's been done by some of our friends at some large consulting organizations, the opportunity in open data and data sharing is upwards of $3 to $4 trillion per year. That's almost 20% of US GDP. And a number of businesses, either by first order or second order derivatives, have been therefore predicated on open data being made available by not just the public sector, but increasingly by the private sector. The view that we take at Dial is that we understand that data is a strategic asset for commercial organizations. But we also understand that data is an information good. And a number of commercial organizations have reached the level of data sophistication or data-driven sophistication in their businesses because they've been able to build through years of data availability through the public sector. So I'll give you an example. Some of you may be aware of the acquisition of Climate Corporation by Monsanto in 2013. That was a $1.1 billion acquisition. But if you look at the products and services that Climate Corporation offered at the time, there were 30 years of weather data, 60 years of crop yield data, and about 15 years of soil data. And all this had been ultimately made available free of charge, free of cost, by at least 4 to 5 US government agencies for the past 30 to 40 years. Climate Corp was able to ingest their data, analyze their data, and develop products and services that they will repackage and sell it back to the service provider community. And so I think there is, by its very design, an implicit and symbiotic relationship between the public and private sector when it comes to open data and data sharing. I think the idea is how can you essentially reduce the friction of both sectors participating and working together. So I'd like to talk a bit more about that today.
Thank you, Zaid. Maybe your view from the satellite.
Sure thing. Morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rhiannon Price, and I am with Digital Globe, one of the leading satellite imagery providers in the world. And so we own and operate our own constellation of satellites, all very high-resolution satellites. And so as the kind of private sector representative on the panel today, I'll do my best, like Syed, to share some anecdotes, but also not only from the perspective of Digital Globe as a content provider, but to also try to kind of represent the breadth of the private sector. Because we are, just like those of you in the room today, a very diverse space. So you have, publicly traded companies, you have startups, you have content providers who are well established, you have a whole variety of business models. And so it's really important, particularly from the perspective of open data, to be cognizant of those different incentives. And so for companies, when it comes to really advocating for open data, there's of course a spectrum of open data. And that doesn't always mean that it's free and open, although I think there are some of you out there and others in the community that that are more open data zealots who have hard and fast definitions when it comes to open. But when we think about open, we think about the spectrum, and thinking about it almost in terms of, kind of the base information. So for Digital Globe, that's the satellite imagery itself, and then also the derivatives. And so there's a multifaceted approach when it comes to open. So you need to be cognizant of some of those levers. So for us, for instance, Digital Globe, because so much of our business model is predicated on revenue and profitability from the sales of our imagery, and that's been kind of traditional in the industry. But we're actually seeing a shift, particularly with some of the new entrants into the satellite imagery market, where imagery is being commoditized. And I think actually that's to the great benefit of the global development community. And so you're seeing kind of a push towards more information, insights, extracting information from imagery at scale. And that's actually a great opportunity for companies like Digital Globe, but others, to be able to open up, particularly the derivatives, which I would say in most cases are far more valuable in a development context than the imagery itself. And so those are opportunities for development organizations to engage with companies and to be aware of kind of our business models, but also the incentives and kind of the pressure that you can place when it comes to better data licensing or more flexible data licensing. And I think that's something where Digital Globe in particular has really been leading the pack, but I think that's something where we shouldn't need to be leading. I think it should be something where companies are more open to, particularly for this space, for this sector, of allowing more flexible data sharing, because that's part of the nature of your work, that there's never a single organization that's deployed on the ground in country using the data. Oftentimes it's a consortium of partners, or you're doing it in collaboration with governments or other stakeholders. And so if you're not able to share those data or have somewhere along the spectrum of open data, it's really debilitating to your mission. And so that's something where I think the understanding on the side of private sector, as well as the understanding on the other side of the table, which is the development community, is really critical, and just knowing where folks are coming from in terms of their positioning.
Thank you very much. Before giving you the word, I would like to hand over the moderation of this panel to my friend and colleague, Michael.
Hi, apologies for that. So just a quick introduction to myself. I know we've already done a round. So my name is Michael Tsan. I am a partner with Dahlberg, and I lead Dahlberg's technology practice. I'm also the liaison to our big data analytics for good business, Dahlberg Data Insights, the business that Frederick, my colleague, leads. And so I guess to continue the conversation, what we wanted to do is talk about the opportunities and the challenges for the sharing of private sector data. And that's not because private sector data is the only kind of data that is relevant and that is valuable for the development sector and for social impact. But there have been other sessions in the last few days, and there will be quite a few sessions today that focus on government data and development sector data. So we really wanted to focus in during this session specifically on private sector data. And we're talking here about large data sets, big data, because obviously there are all kinds of data, and the challenges and opportunities and the means for data sharing differ depending on the kind of data one talks about. So we're talking about data from telcos, we're talking about data from financial institutions, we're talking about data from various kinds of players that are generating very large data sets. These could be retailers, these could be utilities of various sorts. And there are a few things that we're going to touch on. The first is just a bit of a state of play. What are we seeing today? What are the challenges? But really very quickly pivoting to the opportunities and the new and emerging models for data sharing. And then we'll really focus a bit on the future. How is this all likely to evolve? And what should you, as people who are either representatives of the private sector or the public sector or the donor sector, how should you think about approaching the question of data sharing as you go about the work of your own organizations? But maybe turning to our panel, the first question, Ms. Jawo. So just for the round of intro, so please, Jawo.
So, yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Jao Ku. I'm a researcher at institute called International Food Policy Research Institute based in Washington, D.C., and we are part of CGIAR consortium. And we just launched it, last Monday we launched this Big Data in Agriculture platform, so I'm going to talk more about the academia and the research part, how we want to use private sector data and introduce some of the use cases that we have been developing for the last few years. I would.
Terrific, thank you, Jawo. So just starting maybe with the challenges. What are the challenges that you're seeing in your organizations to data sharing? Is it actually difficult? People talk about it being difficult, both from the perspective of the private sector to share their data and from the perspective of the development community and the impact community to access these data sets. So is it actually difficult, and why is it so difficult? What are the biggest pain points?
You know, in times like this, some historical context is always useful. If you look at a typical structure of an industry, even of the oil industry, before you had oil futures, or in the 1910s, or even before the spot market for oil was created in the 1970s, there was about 2 to 3 decades of market turbulence, what I would say, when the market was clearing up and market structures were being defined. I think we are still in the mainframe era of data and analytics in general, and our understanding as a society, and understanding as a business, and understanding as a non-profit sector of what that means. As we think about some of the challenges, Michael, that you talked about, everybody in this room is very sensitive to the aspects of data privacy, data protection, et cetera, and rightfully so. When you have a public health organization, an NGO, that is having a dialogue with a pharmaceutical company, for instance, about open data or data sharing, that NGO is sensitive to the fact that the pharmaceutical firm is probably the most regulated industry in the world. And for them to hand over any aspect of data to a less regulated, almost no, an organization that's really not related at all, is a bit of a challenge, right? And so you have campaigns, and so that's one aspect which is like data protection, right, which is fairly straightforward. I think there's not much to discuss over there. But I think at the same time, there is a lot of what we call dead data or dormant data that is lying in a number of these organizations. I want to give you 2 examples, right? So first is, continuing on the example of public health, for instance, in pharmaceutical industry, the FDA requires in the US, for example, for every clinical trial to be published and to be made available no matter what by any pharmaceutical company. A couple of years ago, they did an audit. They found that 50% of clinical trial data was not reported. These companies were just not reporting it. And so today, all these activist investors, hedge funds, mutual funds that have $3 to $4 trillion of investments have declared a campaign, all trials, for example, which says that you guys have to make this data available, right? You have to make it available because the law requires you to do so. You have to make it available because our investors require that. You have to make it available because ultimately we're going to be building up that body of knowledge that clinical trials provide. And of course, we understand that organizations have their own commercial drivers in terms of not providing that data or otherwise, but I think this is a gross, it's almost a red herring to hold up this idea about, well, data protection, privacy, therefore let's stop the conversation right there. I think that's a big challenge, right? The second example I want to provide is from the perspective of just understanding industry structure from a nonprofit perspective. Today, when we go and have a conversation with, say, anybody in the telecommunication industry, they do not want to hear about data philanthropy, as I think, again, everybody in this room is quite sensitive to. The telecommunications industry spends about $250 billion on CapEx every year. Data volumes in their networks have grown by 50x, but their revenue for data has not grown by more than 2x. Their return on invested capital is in the lowest single digits. Their revenue growth is anemic to the point of 2.3% a year. And again, they're very heavily regulated. And of course, the digitals are eating their lunch. So tomorrow if you go with them and you say, hey, I want your data, I want access to your CDRs or whatever, they're not even going to talk to you. They're going to be, again, on a list of 50 priorities, it's the lowest for me. And so what we try and do at Dial and through a network of partners, a lot of whom are in this room today, is to think about what is that optimal framework, ecosystem that will provide the right incentives, technical, commercial, and governance-oriented, that'll have the private sector to participate in some way, form, or another. So they cannot hold up these examples, I would say, at the risk of being slightly provocative of data protection and privacy, because that's a very easy thing to hold up and therefore curtail the conversation right there.
So you've highlighted a number of challenges, but maybe turning to a representative of the private sector, Rihanna, can you talk about when people knock on your door and ask for satellite and imaging data, how does that interaction go? When does that go well? When does that go poorly? And what is challenging about those interactions?
Yeah, great question. So, Michael, I think I'll answer your question building on some of the things that Syed said, actually, because I think it really is twofold. It's one, the regulatory side and being cognizant of some of the challenges when it comes to security and privacy, particularly for a satellite imagery company, that's critical. So we're heavily regulated because of the fact that with what you call ITAR regulations, which regulates space assets, essentially, we have to make sure that certain countries don't get access to our imagery so that, bad actors essentially can't use it against us or against folks in the field. So for instance, we were part of the Satellite Sentinel project when the Sudan referendum was happening with Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. It was funded by Enough Project. And we were releasing imagery embedded within reports in near real time of the situation because we were doing electoral violence monitoring and trying to actually evidence some of the human rights abuses that were happening at the time. And the concern, particularly from the analysts at Harvard, were that those imagery were being used by bad actors in Sudan against the South Sudanese. And so that's just one example, and there are many like that where you have to be cognizant of when you do open up data or imagery or whatever it is, what are the potential unintended consequences of doing so. So that's one aspect. I think the other, and Syed touched on this as well, is thinking creatively in those discussions. So when you do approach a company around open data or opening up some facet of data, think about it from their opportunity cost perspective. So it's kind of traditional thinking in the business community to think about, well, will this cannibalize future revenue? Particularly, I think companies, generally speaking, really want to do well by humanitarian and global development use cases. It's something that's compelling and folks more often than not do want to support. But their question is, if I open up this data, am I losing an opportunity to sell those data in the commercial space? Or will my commercial partners who have bought those data miss out or come after us to look for open data as well, which is a different beast altogether. And so I think, my advice would be for when you're approaching a company to flip the narrative, to, like Syed said, help them think about unlocking value from untouched assets. So for us, we have petabytes and petabytes of imagery. We started collecting imagery downlinking it at least in 2001. So we've got 16 years of a time lapse of imagery, and we're collecting terabytes every day. And so there's no possible way that we can, one, commercialize, but also understand the value of that kind of immense image library. So I think that's the opportunity for development partners to say, we can help you build markets in areas, rural communities, and areas where you really are not working right now. And we can also help you understand a whole diverse body of use cases that otherwise you're not focused on because you don't work in this space typically.
Yeah, so, the interesting thing about DigiGlobe is, you are in the data business, so you think about the value of your data, you think about how to get your data out there and how to monetize it, how to capture its value. A lot of the data that the development sector wants to access sits within private sector organizations in which data may not be their business. They may be generating very large data sets, but they often do not know the value of that data, and they don't even know how to really get it out there, what it takes, what the costs of that are, what the complexities of that are. So maybe turning to you, Javo, in the work of IFPRI, a lot of the data sets that you want to access or do access as part of your work are not data sets that necessarily the organizations that hold them know how to value or even think about the value of that data. So how does that interaction work? And what are the challenges that you see when you approach those kinds of data sets?
Right. So I think just again, building on what Sai mentioned earlier about the symbiotic relationship with what Rihanna mentioned. So there are a lot of these the untapped potential of the data being used for only narrowly focused application in the private sector. I think that that's kind of the main key point here. I mean, we do have the wishes and desire to access more data to improve our modeling tool, for example. So yeah, my academic background is crop modeler, so I develop and I also manage computer simulation model that predict how farmers crop growth and yield will change under different scenarios. The model is only good as good as the quality of data. We often only use publicly available research data from our academic institutions. The private sector partners do also use our data, our model, for their application, but they don't see the value of investing or sharing their data to public sector so that once the models are improved, they also get benefits. So I think this is kind of conversation piece. It's not necessarily a huge barrier like in between public and private sector partners, but it's more of the opening the dialogue and finding the right entry point with each other and finding the symbiotic relationship with each other. I think that will be the key. We actually had a quite successful relationship with Monsanto a few years ago. They were generously opened up their crop trial data because Monsanto is also using our crop model as one of their tools, but they haven't quite developed the capacity of improving the model by themselves. There are a lot of models that are being developed in academic sector again. So instead of kind of doing it separately in parallel, they shared all the data with academic institutions who are developing this model, and as a return, the model got improved and better quality, and then they also get benefit from it. So I think that finding that relationship is really good.
So that's one interesting example with Monsanto, but maybe talking about others and just getting into pivoting from challenges to data sharing to the different models for data sharing. So I'm going to turn it over to the group to talk about some of these different models. But before we do that, I mean, one way that people in this sector, in the data for good sector, talk about data sharing is from the perspective of data philanthropy. It's talking about the obligation of the private sector and frankly the benefits to the private sector, whether they be reputational or things that align with the missions of private sector organizations, to open their data to generate value for society. A very different lens on this is the lens of data monetization. It's about the incentives for the private sector to put their data out there in ways that actually generate bottom line value for the organization, either in the near term or in the long term. And depending on the school of thought that you come out of, the models for data sharing can be very different. So maybe just talking about some of the models out there, and then we can talk about which of those models work best and which ones work less well. Syed.
So I want to put some constraints on that question, if I may, Michael, in terms of this, maybe a sector-specific lens to what a typical model for data sharing may look like. Let's kind of just build on the example of mobile network operators, for instance, and some of the larger digital platforms, for instance. So in the markets that we are providing support and intervention and services, we find that there is typically less than 10% smartphone penetration. So for that reason, we cannot potentially partner, at least for the foreseeable future, with the Facebooks and the Amazons, with the Googles, and some of the other digital platforms. We have to go to the MNOs because they are the only custodians of any sort of digital footprint of a given population. And to work with them, of course, in the beginning, the idea and the framework that we approach them with is really around taking away any sort of friction of participation. And that friction comes in, I would say, three aspects. There's the technical friction of participation. There is the business model / commercial aspect, and there's the data governance aspect. So we try and have that dialogue with them across all those three pillars. And I think there's something to be said for the sophistication of the nonprofit sector. And I would say that everybody in this room deserves a pat on their back in the way that over the past 10 years, the mental model of the private sector and how they want to work with the nonprofit sector has changed dramatically. They understand that the nonprofit sector also brings in a significant amount of sophistication when it comes to the technical aspect that I talked about. And so for us as Dial, when we approach telcos, and when I talk about reducing the friction of their participation from a technical perspective that requires building out a rather sophisticated data lake or a sense and respond platform or a cognitive decisioning platform or any sort of derivative of an enterprise service bus that will help us get access to telco data in an anonymized fashion, and then we can develop and build insights off that. Right? So we do not ask them for any resources. They do not think that there's a cost involved over there. And ultimately, we help them reach a segment of their population that was completely a black hole to them to begin with. Right? So there's a lot of value, shared value creation that happens from that aspect. From a commercial aspect, we definitely want to elevate the conversation to putting the right incentives in place for telcos and digitals to participate in this. And so, although it's not as much about data monetization, at least not right now. I mean, if we go out to the telcos and say that, hey, we'll open up a new revenue stream for you, we'll probably get laughed out of the room. But what we can probably tell them is that, look, we can help you understand your customers better because this audience understands that segment of the population better than anybody in the world, than telcos ever can, than market research engines ever can. And so we can help them understand that segment of the population and help them price their products and their offerings accordingly. There's a lot of value in that. So building those right commercial structures that help price different varieties, volume, and availability of data, and then also reach different customer segments. And then finally, on the governance perspective, there's a very, of course, this is a new field of inquiry, and so from a governance and data protection regime perspective, it's educational for all of us at this time. Working with the right actors in the data ecosystem, the institutional legal frameworks, as well as a lot of other, I would say, nonprofits and social impact organizations to figure out what is the right balance that we want to strike in any given country. And again, although we do say that, of course, every country is different, the promise of digital is that there's almost 80% replicability from market to market. And so providing the right governance structures, both from a data protection perspective, but also from the incentives and from a data share and open data perspective, that's the third pillar that we try and address. And that's where I would say we need the most help from everybody in the audience today. So as you approach data holders, and I've given you an example of one sector along those three dimensions, you kind of completely flip the conversation around shared value creation, and it's not essentially just about data philanthropy anymore.
So that's the telco sector. I'm just curious how that plays out in other sectors that we have represented here. So maybe Rhiannon, if you talk about how this works in the space of satellite imaging. I mean, is data philanthropy an unhelpful concept for you as an organization that has valuable data and that's monetizing that data? And how do you think about that tension?
I think, I think it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So there's a time and a place for data philanthropy, and we engage in that kind of model as well. So particularly when it comes to crisis response or disaster response. So earlier this year, we launched our open data program, and the focus of that program is open imagery, in fact, which is a big leap for us, but open imagery to support disaster response. And so we release pre- and post-event imagery so that we can work with partners like Humanitarian OpenStreetMap and NetHope and Team Rubicon and the United Nations, help get information to folks on the ground who really need it and make those kind of critical decisions. That said, and to your point, Michael, I think when you think about scalable and sustainable initiatives, it helps to engage companies in a way that's beyond data philanthropy. And I say that because it allows us as companies to invest more of our time and resources into achieving those outcomes, especially when there's alignment of incentives. And it also allows us to tap into some of the intangible kind of resources that we have. So for instance, our convening power. And so, companies like Digital Globe and many others not only work in the development space, but also work across a number of segments where there are technologies or approaches that can be really beneficial to development community. an example would be last week we launched our OpenStreetMap Alliance. And so what we did was we took the kind of vested interest from the development community in terms of enabling essentially a digital globe imagery service into OSM to allow for tracing. And this is a global-based map that we've ported into OSM. And the reason why we're able to do that and kind of open up or unlock that imagery is because not only were we hearing from partners, from OSM users, that that was a huge need, but we knew that there was a commercial interest from other folks that we work with, particularly in Silicon Valley. And so they essentially sponsored and fronted the cost of us being able to put our imagery into OSM and unlocked an immense amount of value. So it's early days still. It's 1 week since we launched that. But I see that as being more of the model moving forward and something that, particularly for development organizations in this kind of uncertain times when it comes to donor funding, I think those kind of creative ways and creative approaches to funding what you need and tapping into others within the private sector, whether it's the, these kind of data, philanthropic capitalists, as they say, I think that's a huge opportunity where we can help, Dial can help, because of we kind of have one foot in both worlds and can help traverse that as well.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Joe, from in your world, as you think about private sector data that's relevant, weather data, data from agricultural value chains from farmers or those who buy from them and who sell to them, what interesting models have you seen that for data sharing that both generate value for the sector but also generate value for the private sector data holders?
That's a very interesting question. First, I wanted to make sure that when we say private sector, that also includes smallholder farmers. It may be a little bit cliche here, but so they have also stake in the game. Not just the private sector has large-scale farm in terms of agriculture, has generated lots of data. We also want to know exactly how farmers manage their farm and how much they produce under what situation, and that's also very valuable data. So we haven't quite done that, implemented that yet, but we have been brainstorming what will be the way that also share that. Like for example, if we can purchase data directly from smallholder farmers, if there is a way to do that sustainably, also not to disrupt too much of their livelihood, I think we'll be happy to also try that out. There are, the private sectors across the value chain, there are all these, a lot of incentive to also share, incentive to purchase the data, to share the data, but often the quality is questionable. And so when there is because there is this very thin kind of balance here. If the incentive is too much, then maybe there introduce bias of the quality of the data. So we don't want to again put the artificial bias or the questionable quality in the pool of the data. But again, if there is enough control or measures taken, then I don't necessarily think this monetization of data across the value chain is a bad thing. I think we have to find a way to kind of cultivate it so that we can all benefit from the improved quality of the data.
So maybe, I don't know if you have some time to take a few quick questions from the audience for the group, because obviously there's so many different dimensions to this conversation. We're just glossing the very surface of this. But maybe 2 or 3 quick questions.
And while you're thinking of your questions, I invite everybody to be provocative. So if you have burning questions, we're all ears. We would love to have a true dialogue.
So I'm getting a signal that perhaps we should actually maybe wrap. So just a final question for the panel. As we look towards the future, so we talked about some of the challenges to private sector data sharing. We talked about, and those range from policy challenges to business model challenges to data privacy complications with some of the data sets that we're talking about. We talked about a few models for data sharing that generate value to the data holders and generate value to the people who are trying to get the data. But as you look towards the future, what is the thing that you're most excited about in this sector? And maybe concrete examples of what makes you excited in terms of models you've seen or recent developments you've seen that you think are going to unlock a lot more value from the data that is currently locked within the private sector and could benefit humanity more broadly?
I can chime in real quick. I would say new business models, just being more creative, I think is really where I've seen so much promise, and particularly when it comes to having companies work alongside kind of disparate actors, so just not working with ourselves or having kind of consortiums of partners. I say this because, again, from the perspective of Digital Globe, when we think about geospatial big data, there's an immense, swath of insights that you can kind of unlock from those types of assets. And so if we can kind of shift the question away from selling on a pixel basis or per square kilometer to actually, focusing on the value derived and engendering that with new business models, that to me is where the promise lies, and I think where we've already seen some really incredible advances, particularly when it comes to, our partnership with Facebook is a good example where they've tapped into our imagery and our geospatial big data platform and are releasing high-resolution population density maps openly with the understanding that it can be very valuable to the development community. And so I think that's just one example of a new business model in play, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that moving forward.
I'll be very brief in the interest of time. I think we haven't talked today about personal data per se. I think that there has to be, what I'm most excited about, among a lot of other things, is the fact that users eventually at some point as the market clears will get more control over their data. And as and when that happens, and that asymmetrical relationship that users have with large digital corporations, and the inability that they have to port their data, to monetize their data, to understand who has their data, I think all that has to, at some point, either through regulatory pressure or through just the right incentives in the commercial system, has to go away. And as users exercise more power of their data and have more idea about the fidelity and the availability of their data, I think that adds a whole new layer of understanding of population characteristics that is being surreptitiously done now, that's going to be made available in a more open fashion going forward.
When we were developing our proposal for the platform we just launched, we had a very interesting conversation with IBM, who are developing this IBM Watson with artificial intelligence being applied in many different sectors, but not in agriculture yet. So we were developing kind of concept of we provide our research data to train Watson to be really smart and making decisions support at super smart level, so that that tool can be also open to smaller farmers, and so that they can interact with Watson to get better decision support information. So yeah, we are also trying to, again, there's no other secret formula here, we're trying to find a win-win kind of relationship with a very capable private sector partner. I think that is our goal.
Thank you, Joe. So I just want to thank the panel. If we can just have a round of applause for the panel. And we obviously have just raised the questions, probably haven't answered them, but hopefully that leads to some interesting discussions later today across the data track.
Thank you. That was good. I request everyone among the speakers to be on time because we are trying our best to keep the plenary on time. The next speaker that we have is Dr. Shadrach Robert, and his topic is Data Technology Power. What is the future we want? I would request him to please come on stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I want to talk to you about a few things that you may not normally think about when you're considering what are barriers to sharing data, or what might enable data. And these three things are procurement, the idea of pushing information, and power relations. There's a couple different things I'm going to cover in my talk. If you're interested in more details, you can look me up on Twitter. You don't even have to be a Twitter user. You just look up my page. I've just sent a link out to an open document that everyone can access that will give you some more details, links to data sets, different things that I'm going to mention. For about 10 years, I've been a geographic analyst. I use that digital globe data to pull information out of satellite imagery, do mapping analysis. I've worked in big organizations like USAID. I've been on mission with the UN. I now work for a software company called Ushahidi. And one of the things that I've noticed over time is that all of the products that I was developing for decision makers actually didn't seem to influence decisions the way that I thought they should. So I've become increasingly involved and interested in this idea of data as something that you can convene people around, as data as a tool for community engagement and for empowerment. So this is the first time I've given this talk, and some of these ideas really crystallized for me during a project I was doing in Indonesia. And I was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And they said, okay, Ushahidi makes this software that allows people to crowdsource and collect citizen reports, and we'd really like to see if this can be used to improve the relationship between citizens and government. So I went there, and I spent some time in the field, and I got to know this organization, an amazing organization. They're called Hysteria, which I often found pretty amusing because that was a kind of a name that you didn't hear very much in my line of work. So I was working with Hysteria, and they're not an NGO. They're a group of artists. They're activists. They don't see themselves as development professionals in any way. But they were doing all sorts of really interesting data collection that they saw as art. This gets to something Emmanuel was saying yesterday about why we measure our children, that data collection is really an expression of interest. So they would do things like they would draw these big maps on these big billboards, and they would carry them around to these different art events they were doing and have people put stickers on these maps to show places that they thought in this case were romantic or places that they loved about their city. And I started asking them, do you have concerns about what's going on in your neighborhood with government services? Like, I see that you're doing all this artwork, but are there real issues that you want to solve? They said, yes, of course, we have plenty. And we've been trying to connect with the government, but they see what we're doing just as art and kind of this funky punk rock activism, and they don't really want to listen to us. We're too far outside for that. So I said, okay, well, what if we move some of what you're doing into an online environment? And what if we frame it as data around a development or a resilience challenge? They were really interested in this idea, so we started working on it. And the first thing we did is went into the neighborhoods where they had been real active and started talking to people about what data meant to them and what sort of things they would expect from this type of exchange or this type of project. And this is one of the very first things you have to do when you're talking about data is you have to identify the demand. If it's donor-driven, all you're going to end up with is something online. It's abandonware is a phrase that I like. It's a project that gets thrown online and then just sits there. So after we started building relationships in the community and figuring out how people were going to try and interact with this data ecosystem we're creating, we could go out and we could start talking to city government. And I love this picture because this is a bunch of people who see themselves as left-wing artist activists hanging out with very, very formal government officials, looking at data, looking at maps. And this was then our opportunity to start adding value and say, would you like us to digitize this map for you so that you can share it easily online instead of having to move this piece of paper from office to office? Are you missing some data here? This is what the panel was just talking about. Can we co-create some value? Can we go into this neighborhood and get information that might be helpful for you? So we're adding value. So all of this is about building relationships. After the relationships start to form up, then we can start talking about data collection and technology. So we had support on the data collection from the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. You may have heard a little bit about OpenStreetMap. It's like a Wikipedia of maps. I really encourage you to talk to Tyler Radford, the executive director who's here. They do great work. And they have this great methodology where you take satellite imagery and you print it out on paper. And you take it to people in a way that they can understand it. So we were doing training with local youth. We were training Hysteria on how to interpret imagery. Going into these neighborhoods, people were drawing out and saying, yeah, this is a house here, this is a building here, but it's not just a building, it's a mosque, and it's not just a mosque, it has water services for the neighborhood, and. Then we can take that back, and then we can digitize it. we start putting hundreds of thousands of buildings into the OpenStreetMap database with real detailed annotation about where things are, what people are using. So now we have all this biophysical data, which in itself is interesting. It may be useful for first responders to understand how to get in and out of some of these slums that are very difficult to navigate. It might be interesting for a company that wants to do economic development research about the types of services and homegrown industries that exist in this neighborhood. But that wasn't the point. The point was to gather citizen feedback. So we've created all this biophysical data, and now we can go out and we can start to get community feedback. We bring OpenStreetMap into Ushahidi, and we use Ushahidi to collect information from people. But we have to do that in a way they can understand. So we used Hysteria's own capacity in doing murals, in doing art events, and we started reaching out to the community in a way they could understand. Graffiti on a wall that they pass every day, explaining, this is that project that we were telling you about, and here's where you can send us a text message. Here's where you can go online and view this if you like, and here's dates that we're going to do something new. And here's this leader in your neighborhood who's approved us to do this project. So in the end, we produce all sorts of biophysical data about the neighborhood. We get over 1,000 different reports about what's happening in the neighborhood. It all exists online. You can go, you can download different types of data for different reasons. I'm very proud of that. But this wasn't the goal. The online ecosystem wasn't the goal. The goal was to improve governments and citizens working together. And because of this process, Hysteria got invited to sit on a citizen steering commission within government. The city government in Semarang, Indonesia, now follows their activities and advertises what they do. So we have that improved relationship. And for me, this all gets back to the fact that you must have a social wrapper around the data. The data in themselves are not always the most important thing. Often it's the people, and it's the relationships. So what are a few things that I've learned in 10 years of doing all sorts of different data-related projects? I'm reluctant to admit this, but I spend most of my time thinking about procurement, which is often very painful and very inflexible, and I feel like the woman in this slide. We have a system that says most of the time that you're going to sign onto a contract with a donor that's going to expect that in 3 to 5 years you produce certain outcomes in a sector, and you're going to have to spell those out. I was talking to Kwame the other day about a project that was kind of interesting, and it was they were trying to feed students so that they would go to school, they would have more energy, they would retain more information. And he was talking about one of the interesting aspects of this program would be perhaps changing the food source so that it wouldn't be being shipped in from the outside, but maybe using local vendors. So I posited this question. I said, that's really interesting. If in 18 months, the data that you get back say, in fact, you're having no effect on the students, they're not retaining any more information, dropout rate's the same, but that you're having all these amazing outcomes with the vendors, that there's all sorts of microfinance stuff happening, and there's women's empowerment going on, and they're starting collectives, and there's better nutrition available to the city. Could you pivot? Can you switch from being an education program to a women's empowerment or microfinance program? The answer is usually no. And this is a barrier. Because if I get data back that I cannot react to, why would I share it and how can I listen to it? I would love to see technology working to help us improve procurement, to help look at smart contracts, the way we can program more flexible adaptation. Pushing information versus pulling information. This program worked because I reported to Hysteria as much as they reported to me. Because I could give them a window into city government that they didn't have. This is a project that Mercy Corps did that I love. It's called Refugee Info. They're talking about it at 12:30. Please go. It's a fantastic project. They were meeting migrants getting off boats, going through Europe, helping them recharge their cell phone, and putting structured data that we have in their hands. Do you need the most updated information on border closures? Here it is. What does it mean to get asylum in this country? Here you go. What are the emergency numbers you should be aware of? Here you go. I think we collectively spend too much time thinking we're going to pull unstructured data out of people via Twitter or Facebook or whatever, when we don't spend pushing the structured information that we already have. My final point. For me, it all comes back to this. Data without action are meaningless. And I don't want sector-based development. I want science-based development, which means that I often need to listen to data that tell me that I have to alter the power structure of an organization that I'm in. When I organized USAID's first use of crowdsourcing ever to clean up and publish agency data, I had to spend as much time with lawyers as I did with technologists. I had to be an advocate that was willing to change power structures within my organization. And especially with some of the changes we're seeing in the global order right now, there may actually be more than institutionalogical barriers to your data sharing. There may be ideological barriers to your data sharing. And you have to be an advocate, and you have to be an activist within your own organization. I'll leave you with this final thought. This is something Emmanuel put in his slides yesterday, and I love it. I use it all the time in mine. If we're really going to use data, if we're really going to use technology, if we're going to have science-based development, we have to be willing to change the power structures that govern how we do things so that we can listen to our data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. That was really very informative. I would like to welcome on stage our next speaker, Aditya Agarwal, Director, Data Ecosystems Development, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Mr. Aditya Agarwal.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, being back in my home country after a number of years. So thanks very much to the ICT4D organizers for the invite. And I also wanted to thank all the previous speakers because I think it's really going to set up my conversation pretty well. I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data is doing and how it's approaching data ecosystems, both in terms of how we're supporting all the different partners that are involved in the partnership, but also how data ecosystems are developing in the countries that we're working in. So I think as many of us already know, we're in an era right now where we're working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which previously the paradigm was around the Millennium Development Goals. The big distinction is that it's universal now. It's both for developing and developed countries, where all 193 member countries of the UN have agreed to this framework. And now we're also in a much different era when it comes to technology and data availability and mobile phones and technology, what that really means for how citizens are able to better engage with data and information and governments. So when we're looking at the SDGs, we're looking at 17 goals, 169 targets, and 230 indicators. And what that really means is that there's huge data demands behind that. Arguably, there's not one country in the world right now that's well prepared to be able to address that type of a data framework. And then when we think about what some of the challenges are around data, some of the same challenges that we've talked about for the last 10 years, 20 years, are still exist today. Data are often not available, dynamic enough. They're not disaggregated to the extent that allow for proper decision-making to take place. There's issues around data quality. There's entire groups and populations that are left behind because they're not being accounted for in the population censuses, and so on. And so when we talk so much about data, what do we actually want to do with that? We want it to improve decision-making. We want it to improve policy. We want citizens to be better engaged and empowered through that data, and we want to be able to use all that information to really drive innovation and entrepreneurship. And at the same time, there's the data revolution that's taking place right now that you've heard about previously. But that's really, what's happening now is really trying to bring together government, civil society, and the private sector in a way that really supports how many of the data challenges and gaps can be addressed, and how we can actually unleash innovation through more dynamic, real-time, disaggregated data and its availability. So at the Global Partnership, we're working with a number of different organizations across all different types of data types. So when it comes to Earth observation, we're working with the Group on Earth Observations and NASA and European Space Agency and others, looking at how citizen-generated data works with bringing together official statistics, looking at privately held big data that you heard a lot about this morning, all the different types of business models that are applied there, and then how you can look at call data records as a way to really get at some more dynamic, granular information. And then, of course, open data through organizations like Open Data Institute and the International Open Data Charter. So the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, it was launched in 2015 when the SDGs were adopted. It's housed at the United Nations Foundation, and it's a multi-stakeholder partnership that's really looking to help countries, both at the national and subnational level, achieve against the SDGs. Currently, there's over 200 organizations that are involved in the partnership across all sectors, so bringing in governments, private sector, civil society, academia, and so on. And we're working across three different goals. One being, how do you put data on the political agenda? How do you better connect supply and demand? And what are the key enablers that really allow for that friction on how data flows and becomes more accessible to be reduced? One of the core ways that we're addressing the demand side and the political side of that equation is through a process that we're calling data roadmaps for sustainable development. This process is very fundamental to our work because essentially we're working with a number of countries now to better understand how we can implement whole of government and multi-stakeholder approaches for how the SDGs can be achieved in these countries, with particular emphasis to these being country-owned, locally relevant according to the key issues and priorities within those countries. The most recent workshop that we did was in Ghana in April this year. And from this picture, what you see is we had about 150 participants in that workshop across all the different sectors. And we had huge political buy-in with the vice president of Ghana giving a keynote speech that really spoke to why data is so important when it comes to development, because you're not able to make effective decisions without the data. Now, of course, Emmanuel made a comment yesterday that, just because there's data doesn't essentially mean that you're going to be doing the right thing. But at the same time, if you don't have the data, chances of not doing the right thing are even increased, right? So we have to try to be able to address some of these key data challenges. And I think with all the opportunities that we have around the data revolution right now, those opportunities are only increasing. So what you see here is the countries that we're working with thus far. And through this national workshop process, what we're trying to do is figure out how the SDGs are aligning to national development priorities, regional frameworks, but then also taking into account other data programs that have already been developed in each of the countries. It's very easy when the SDGs come into play for countries and organizations to kind of think about addressing that particular framework without thinking about other national spatial data infrastructures that might be in place, open data readiness assessments. So we really have to think about integrated approaches to make sure that we're being very efficient in how we're able to address data challenges. So within that context, what countries are often doing is taking the SDG framework and localizing that framework according to their national development priorities, and then coming up with a localized framework to be implemented. So from the global partnership perspective, I think as many of you know, the Sustainable Development Goals is mandated under the UN Statistical Commission, and therefore it's the national statistical organizations in each country, for the most part, that are mandated for the data production around that. With the data revolution, when we're looking at how to fill data gaps more effectively, look at real-time and dynamic disaggregated data, we also want to think about how data can be applied for action and decision-making beyond the reporting and monitoring guidelines and requirements that the SDGs provide at the NSO level. So we want to be able to use this data to really have data-driven decision-making take place and be able to develop the types of insights that countries need to make good decisions. And what you see here is a few examples. On the left is Sierra Leone and their agenda for prosperity and how the SDGs are aligning to that framework. On the top right, what Colombia has done is created this traffic light kind of an index to come up with what their data readiness is against SDGs, which basically shows that they have about 56% of the data that they need to address SDGs. And many of the gaps right now are at what they call the tier 3 indicators, where there isn't a global data set or a methodology applied to various indicators. On the bottom right is Philippines, and one of the ways that they're trying to map out their ecosystem with other institutions that they're working with. Just to also reflect on the earlier panel this morning, very difficult for one government institution to get the data that they need to solve some of the problems from other institutions, and then you factor in private sector and civil society on top of that, trying to get access to that data, and those systems are not in place effectively. So that's something that we also have to work on, and we also have to get private sector to actually consume more publicly held data, because that's where innovation and that economic wealth from all this public data becomes more available. So key challenges that we've seen across many of the countries that we're working with is there's the institutional and multi-stakeholder challenges. When it comes to SDGs, there's that question of ownership, which institution actually owns the SDGs, whether it's the Ministry of Planning or the National Statistical Organization or the President's Office. There's, as we've heard earlier today also, trying to figure out what those business models look like with the private sector so that you're able to get the right benefit on each side, both from how you're able to unlock privately held data, but then also what the private sector can also do to support much of the capacity and technical issues that are faced in many of the countries that we're working with. There's huge issues around data gaps and data sharing, like I just spoke about, and interoperability continues to be another issue that's really sort of creating a barrier for how systems are talking to one another and what you're actually able to do with the data. And of course, funding. So what are we doing about this? So at the Global Partnership, there's 200 organizations that are involved. Everyone is working on various facets of how to address the SDGs. And what we're trying to do is really create and catalyze many of these methods that are being developed. So one of the things we're doing is creating a toolbox, which is providing a number of different best practices and guidelines and tools on how to kick off a data roadmap process. What does it mean for data for action when you're working with citizen-generated data or open data or geospatial So I just want to conclude by just coming back to this initial slide, because I think what we're really trying to do is when we're thinking about reporting and monitoring versus data for action and decision making, all these different types of data sources that are now available and all the different sectors that really need to be involved in order to make that happen. There's obviously the technical issues that every country and stakeholder is facing, but by far, one of the key barriers is really the institutional
is it to go back to the individuals and ask them for consent when you probably are not able to find them, they have moved on, they don't have, email, you can't contact them. So it's difficult, I would say.
Al?
Yeah, so I agree. Another take at it, another way to look at it, and I never like it when somebody asks me a question or I ask them a question and they get, well, yes or no, but I'm going to give you a yes or no answer. Kind of a harder and easier. I really see it futuristically becoming easier. Speaking of World Vision, we've been in ICT for D digital programming since 2003, and so we continue to mature that year over year. And so as we move from paper-based to digital-based, obviously it's a lot easier to transfer that information from all the remote regions that we work in to some sort of like centralized repository or several of those, and do some manipulation of that data. So once it's digitized, it's a lot easier to transfer. It's just a lot more transportable and manageable. So that's the easy part. The harder part, though, I see, if you look at the industry, a lot of the conferences and things I go, they talk about mobility and they talk about the cloud. And within the last year and a half, big data, data analytics, predictive analytics, these are all topics of conversation. And so I see the industry moving in that way. I see security just now coming on and providing digital analytics, and there are vendors out there that do such things. But I see privacy even further behind the curve than I do information security. So as we move forward and everything becomes more and more digital and easily transportable, how do you centralize that? How do you manage it? How do you make sure that it's secure, that you have the appropriate amount of privacy and access controls for that digital data? So easier from a transportability standpoint, harder from, well, so what? What are we going to do with that data, and then how are we going to consume it?
Great, and, sorry,
Can I just,
yeah.
I want to provide a balanced view to what I said just now. I did say it was difficult, but I do see some countries taking a more progressive approach towards data analytics. I'll just call out a few countries, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and Hong Kong. And the common theme for all these 4 countries is that they have provided very clear guidance which enables big data. I mean, I don't like the word, but it's shorthand, right? By giving clear guidance to organizations as how the regulator would view anonymization and de-identification, which is one of the tools which you would use in any data analytics project. In fact, Japan amended its law specifically to allow data analytics, to allow anonymization because the culture in Japan was that the law was very stringent and therefore companies were not innovating. So the Japanese government looked at data analytics as another pillar of the economy. Now, you see that trend of these really data savvy and data harbors, right? Singapore, Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, doing that. The hope is that different countries in the region would pick up on that. And that's my hope.
Great, and Neil, why don't you finish up with that, and while Neil's speaking, why don't you all think of questions that you have? I see the 5-minute warning sign.
I'll be as brief as I can.
And just to remind you, Neil,
yes,
you might want to hold up
3 beautiful packs if you're brave enough to ask a question. And
first
if you're
question.
Not, these will be available. CRS have kindly offered to host these at their booth this time, so if nobody's stepping up, we'll leave them there and you can review them. So in terms of whether it gets easier or hard, I guess there's a couple of dimensions to that for us. On an internal basis, in fact, there's 2 dimensions on the internal basis. One is the technology dimension, and I think as Al said, as we move towards the cloud and recognize that organizations that are providing cloud services are going to be better at this than we are. There's also the dimension that the standard sector-wide approach to security of security through obscurity isn't going to wash for very much longer if you have consolidated all your data. The security by obscurity approach is if we can't find it ourselves, then really will anyone else be able to find it and use it? So that's going to go away. So there is an element of our own capacity and technical competency that will grow over time, and that's becoming, as Al says, easier. I think the usage, as my colleague Amy says, our strength is in our weakest link. So how people think about data, use the tools that we're providing is going to become a more important part of their skill set, a more important part of their, almost our code of conduct, that you would be proficient and skilled in using that, and that we also, since Oxfam works mostly with and through partners, that we extend that to our partners and the consultants we work with too. So you can read about our first 2 years. Actually, we just had a review done with the engine room. If you're looking for more specifics on how a responsible data policy implementation can go, they've written a very thorough report of what we have done in our pilot over the last 2 years, and it's on our website and also on the engine room's website. So that's an area of growth for us. On the other side, outside of Oxfam, I think one of the areas that we would love to see more capacity is partnering with other organizations, both in the sector, so that we understand and don't duplicate, replicate, invent the wheel. But also, I think there's an opportunity with the private sector. I mean, my colleague Derek here works with MasterCard. They've figured out privacy laws in every country where you can swipe a credit card. We don't need to necessarily go and invent all of this for all of the small programs that we do and the bigger programs that we do. I think there's an opportunity for corporate social engagement and corporate partnership in a way that maybe we've never considered before around issues of this. I don't think it's something that we would necessarily need to grow ourselves. It has a context that's specific to us. I don't think all of the MasterCard approach to this would work for Oxfam, but I think that there's a huge amount that we could learn. And finally, I guess there's an attitude shift that I think we need to start thinking about the data that we collect, that we as organizations are taking custody of and that are taking ownership of, as if it was our own. As if it was our own family's data. There may not yet be a common universal approach to this. There may not even be a common, right or responsibility framework around this, but that's no reason why we should wait for a proclamation or a global compliance for us to act in a way that we would like to be treated ourselves.
Nice way to end, thank you. So any questions from the audience? I see someone standing back there. I don't know if we have microphones or...
It works. I have a quick question if no one else does. Hi, in the back right here. Hi, Catherine Clifton, CRS.
Oh, there you are. Got it.
Sorry.
I see it.
I feel like there's a lot of talk about these things. I've done research and development, and I've also been a practitioner in the field. And I think that for me, the solution is making it easy. I know I need to do these things, but I need to open ComCare or iForm Builder. I need it encrypted there. I'm putting in personal information I need to happen at that moment. Otherwise, I really feel like it's like the talk is up here and it's really wonderful, but I don't have the time or the tools to make it happen, and I can't set up a different process. I mean, I'm already managing 7 partners at this time that I'm thinking out specifically. We already have so much process in place. Adding to it, it's like our poor partners are saying, can you just give us a break? So I know that large companies have a lot of this figured out, but oftentimes the data solutions we are working with aren't large companies. They're specific for the development sector. It would be very great, and maybe you've seen this happen, can we get the large companies to start talking to our smaller companies so that we don't even have to think about it?
I think that's a great point, Catherine. Actually, you've pretty much summarized the Engine Room's report in just what you said, that it is hard, that policy frameworks are not easy to digest on top of local laws, on top of organizational policies, on top of the country-specific objectives that an organization within a range of organizations in that context are trying to implement. So yeah, one of the things that came out of our review was really like, is it possible to get a checklist, at least so that if we're not providing all the answers, we're at least providing the right questions to ask in a specific context.
Another question? I see someone here.
Hi. All right, so this is a question that speaks to a lot of the discussions that we've had this morning, but it's also a bit specific. So we've looked at what Emmanuel Latouze was talking about with the Data Pop Alliance, and there's been work on using call detail records. CDR. So Derek, you mentioned that sometimes that users don't know that the data is being used for something, and the exact use case evolves over time. So for example, FlowMinder, which works with Emmanuel's organization, has given us a lot of useful insights in the development sector in terms of migration movements and using those call detailed records. So do you think that it's important to make that agreement, that understanding more tacit, or more explicit? When you talk to the people whose phone records are being used, do you think we need to have some kind of a clear agreement? Okay, I suppose I can cut it there.
So just real quickly.
The consent usually needs to be very express. If you're taking in the high water, the highest common denominator approach, it needs to be informed and express. That's very clear. Hence, that's why my suggestion was that, I know it's, highfalutin, policy making and really for the policy wonks in here, but we really need to engage with the policymakers and the legislators and the regulators to educate them that consent is not the be-all and end-all. That's why you're getting into that problem. How do you get express consent when the purpose is going to be different and you can't contact those individuals? You need to have that whole toolbox of reasons, or the legal basis or exceptions, so that you can achieve that public good, that public outcome. And I see it repeatedly over time and time again. It's not that the regulators don't want to give it to you, it's just that we probably aren't aware of the many, 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 many use cases which are good, which you're thinking of. So that conversation needs to be had so that the framework can exist to enable what you're doing.
So I want to thank the panel very much, and thank you for your questions. I think we're moving on.
Thank you. And that was a great session, pretty informative, pretty interactive. And it's time to move to our next speaker. The topic is developing context-appropriate data sharing and protection strategies. I would like to welcome on stage Frank Scott, Vice President of Global Programs, NATO.
Well, good morning. We're in the home stretch here. I've been asked to chat a bit about data sharing strategies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about personal data and maybe share a personal story with you. So about 13 months ago, well, I should also tell you, this is a personal story that I have really never shared with anybody except for my family and a couple of close friends. And I think it's something that, personal data, personal information is very private for most people. But I think this is a good opportunity to share this story as a backdrop for data sharing. About 13 months ago, April of 2016, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was driving to visit a family friend, a father of a family friend who was in hospice. And I had been driving for about 10 minutes and I was feeling a little lightheaded, had a little bit of shakiness, was perspiring a little bit, and I was thinking, gosh, I wonder if I feel anxious about seeing this family friend who is in failing health. So I pulled over to the side of the road, rolled down the window, collected myself, and then decided to continue on. I felt well enough to continue on. I get to the hospice, and as I get out of the car, I nearly faint. So I walk into the hospice and I say, I'm here to see one of your guests, but could you please call 911? And in the United States, 911 is who you call when you need emergency help. So the medics arrived, began hooking me up to all sorts of monitoring devices, and the first words that one of the medics says, his pulse is 240. And I knew that that wasn't good. A reasonable pulse might be 60, 70, 80, 90. 240 seemed kind of high. So then the next technician said, we're not getting a blood pressure reading off of him. That didn't seem very good either. So they hooked me up to an IV, they got the pulse rate down, and they said, we're going to have to transport you to the hospital. So they put me in the back of the aid unit, go to the hospital. They hold me for about 4 or 5 hours for observation, and they conclude that things have stabilized and I can go home. But they say, we want you to call your doctor this week. And so I go to bed, wake up the next morning, it's 8 o'clock, make a cup of coffee, start making my notes of things to do that week, make a note that I should call my doctor. And at 8:05 that morning, my doctor calls me. And he says, I see you were in the emergency room last night. I said, whoa. I said, yeah. And he says, I'd like you to come in this morning. I said, well, I was planning on coming in later this week. And he says, no, I'd like you to come in this morning. And so I came in. He walked me down the hall to a cardiologist, and the cardiologist said, we need to do a procedure on you tomorrow morning. So they did the procedure the next morning. They did another procedure 2 or 3 months later. Everything is fine, totally healthy. But during that process, I began talking to my doctor about how they knew that I had been at an emergency room the night before. Because it was a totally different hospital system, a totally different set of doctors. And so how did they get information from the Swedish hospital chain over to the Overlake hospital chain? All in 12 hours. And he described to me a process that they had done with the doctors in the community where they felt that they could give better health care if they figured out ways to share data. And they went through all sorts of scenarios about sharing data. They talked about data privacy. I asked them all these questions, and I asked them about consent forms. And at the end of the day, I'm convinced that the data sharing problem that they figured out probably saved my life. At least that's what the cardiologist said. So it's an interesting story, I hope, because it sort of illustrates, well, they told me in preparing for this that if I showed pictures of cute dogs, evaluation scores would rise 20%. So 2 cute dogs, more to come. I think we've got a tension when we talk about sharing personal data. And in the international development space, we've all heard that one of our mantras is do no harm. And I think that's something that we all care deeply about. And it doesn't change whether you're in program delivery or whether you're in data protection. We don't want to do any harm. There's also, we're in this business, I think, first and foremost because we want to do good. In fact, we want to do a whole lot of good. And I don't think that's any different whether you're in program delivery or whether you're in data security. But we have this tension that takes place. And we've heard this week about some amazing work where people have been able to use data to do a lot of good. And some of it's very personal data. Some of it's data that if it came into the wrong hands, could actually do harm. So there was a great story yesterday about tracking internally displaced people who were on the move. Obviously, if you want to serve that vulnerable population, knowing where they are, where they're moving to, who they are, is hugely helpful. It's also potentially dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. We've seen health applications where they're gathering much of the same information as my doctors were gathering. And I'd say I'm darn glad that my doctors didn't anonymize my data. It had to stay personal. They had to know who I was in order for them to be able to treat me in a timely manner. There's been some discussion about some of the work that Facebook's done. Facebook probably gathers more personal data than just about any organization in the world. And last year, Facebook collaborated around the Zika virus and helped measure how effective the communications were around the Zika virus campaign. Were people getting the message? What were they saying? And were the right people being targeted? We also know that there's a ton of data coming through Twitter feeds, and there's whole companies that are analyzing Twitter data, and you can pretty easily determine where that data is coming from. So there's huge opportunities for personal data to do good. There's no question about that. And I think that the call to action for all of us is at the micro level. If you're involved with program design, let's bring in the data security, the data privacy people early on. Same way you would with M&E. You want to bring them in. It's not an add-on. It's an integral part of the program. And for those people who have data security as part of your daily job, help us. Put on your can-do hat and help us figure out ways, especially with personal data, so that personal data can be used to improve the human condition. At kind of a macro level, we've seen this morning some organizations, some of our partner organizations, USAID and DIAL, and then some of the NetHope member organizations like World Vision and Oxfam and CRS, all doing great work. And I would suggest that our call to action collectively is to bring that work together so that we can accelerate the adoption of techniques that help us do more good with data and protect data even more than we already are. And I think if we can do that, we can improve development outcomes and we can save lives. Thank you.